guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Alexis and today I'm going to be sharing all the books that I read for May 2022. I'm not sorry that I'm posting this really late, but it is what it is and I just now got around to it. So with that being said, let's get into the first book. The first book that I completed during the month of May was To Covet a Countess by Sapna Bog. This is the second book in her Elusive Lords series. The first one, Dare to be a Duchess, followed Lara and Wolf. Lara is the cousin of Sania, who is the heroine in this story, and Wolf, her love interest, is the best friend of Nicholas in this story. So if you want to see my thoughts on the first book, feel free to check out that video. But with that being said, this story follows Sania and her sister. They essentially fled India in order to avoid the controlling life that would be if she stayed and inevitably married a controlling person. But by fleeing, they come to find that Lara and her new husband are away from home, and it is bitterly cold, so they are quite freezing and starving, exhausted. So Nicholas happens upon them. He sees that these supposed strangers are about to break in or attempting to break into the Duke's home. So he goes to look upon the situation, and Sania, in an attempt to protect herself and by extension her sister, who wasn't present at the time of their initial meeting, she collapses from exhaustion, and Nicholas decides then and there to take her and her sister back to his home in order to, recover and revive themselves before the return and in wait of the return of Lara and Wolf from their holiday. I will say that although the premise was very interesting to me, and this was a new to me author, kind of, it's only the second book I read by her. The plot itself felt too instant and the relationship not well developed, in my opinion, obviously. But with that being said, I do appreciate that, it did draw on some interesting topics of having Nicholas idolizing this person and then by doing so not being able to recognize the flaws of this person and in such not fully being able to accept the good, the bad, and the ugly right off, but over time he's able to accept it and come to terms with the fact that the love of his life is being negatively effective, so he should be standing by her. And this also draws interesting conversation about, I guess you could say, the Me Too movement, because it comes down to choosing to listen to those victimized by people who aren't the type to have good intentions. So with that being said, I did give this 3 out of 5 stars. The next book I completed was Betting on a Duke's Heart by Royaline Singh. I will say this is a third-person story. It features a historical romance, multicultural romance. It does include bigotry, death of loved ones, alcoholism, mention of suicide, and possibly depression. So essentially this book followed Dina, who had an award-winning horse, and Adius, if I'm saying his name correctly, he intended to marry her to gain possession of said horse, because he was, the type of person to be in horse racing, and they had some banter, some heated moments, but overall it felt too lax for me, nor did I care about the fact that they were so obsessed with horses. It's just not my niche, it's not my sport. I could care less. I never saw the appeal, but do you? And perhaps this just wasn't a story that was working for me, but I am open to trying other books by this author. Some of my favorite moments include Dinah in her Arabian dress and Adius seeing her for the first time in said dress, but she was still covered in a way that her identity wasn't obvious to other people, but he was able to recognize her. I thought that was really sweet. There's also a moment with the ladder. Someone falls, the others worries, and you'll just have to read if you're interested to see what I'm talking about. But Dina is half Indian on her mother's side, and her father was English. So there's some talk of culture there. Not too much though, and the audiobook did feature two narrators. I do want to point that out as well. So it was kind of difficult for me to adjust to their respective accents and their reading speeds. So for an audiobook, this, in my opinion, was not the greatest experience, and this was another 3 out of 5 stars. So, after a couple of average books, I went into When the Marquess Falls, and this is by Lorraine Heath. It is technically a prequel, story wise, for the Hellions of Havisham trilogy that she created, and this is noted as 3.5 in Goodreads. So, if you are curious as to where you may find it, that is it. But this essentially follows George and Linny. It is a historical romance. Again, respectively, you can see from the title. It is a friends to lovers romance, forbidden as well due to class differences, and it does include death. If you've already read the Hellions of Havisham series, you are aware of the fact that Linny had already passed away due to childbirth. But this story follows their evolution, and it does end in a happily ever after. Maybe not conventionally what we see in historical romances, but nonetheless just as beautiful. And in fact, I kind of want to see something similar to be done in future books, perhaps by other authors in a different approach, but still having a beautiful afterlife. And you may already be understanding what I'm alluding to, but with that being said, this is third person written, and George and Linny, they were friends in their childhood, but it wasn't until they got older that they started to, acknowledge their attraction to each other. Although Linny, she was the daughter of the baker, and of course, George was in line to be the next Marquess following his father's death. They have a beautiful friendship, and we do get to see the parents of Ashbury and Grayling as well, the Grayling twins from Hellions of Havisham. Again, it's their parents' story, so we do get to see that and how George ended up taking care of all of their sons because of events. So, again, beautiful story. I do recommend reading the Hellions of Havisham trilogy first before this book. That way you're not surprised, but it wouldn't be terrible to start with this if you do want to do that. Just know that it's not a conventional ending. Someone does die, and they do end up together in the end, or beginning, if you will, beginning of things. But this was certainly 5 out of 5 stars for me. The next book that I got to that I wasn't even aware of until I was communicating with the author through Instagram. And she's very responsive, very friendly. I will stand by her books and I will stand by her work probably till, I'm gone, which got really dark there for a second. But anyways, she's probably my favorite contemporary romance author, and that is none other than Kennedy Ryan. I read The Rule of Always, and this is first person dual perspective. It features characters that were in the Grip trilogy, if you are familiar with those books. So in this story, it's a contemporary romance. There's an age gap of 15 plus years, and it's between a teacher or professor and his former TA or teacher's assistant. So the heroine is a bisexual that is briefly mentioned in here, but again, it's a very beautiful story. I wish they got a full length book, but this listening to it would be less than an hour and 20 minutes. I wanted to note that in case you were curious if you want a taste for writing. This essentially follows Iz and Callie. It's 5 years later, meeting again. And they resisted their attraction before because it was forbidden, with him being a professor and her his teacher's assistant. They mutually decided to let things happen and, allow themselves to feel everything that they've been trying to restrain. And I thought that was really beautiful. Izzy does have his own points of view that we got to see a little bit in A Grip, but in this story, it kind of gets more resolved because it's a little bit after the end of the trilogy. So we get to see how he evolved and started to, appreciate the true feelings that Bristol and Grip shared in that trilogy. So in this story, it's kind of him finally being comfortable with himself and being able to love who he wants to love, or allowing himself to, and not being restrained by the confines of society and all that good stuff. So yes, Callie, she is half Japanese and half Cambodian. Mother was Japanese, father Cambodian. And there are just some bookish, brawny things in here that were really adorable, as well as, the dress, Callie's dress. If you read, you'll know what I'm talking about. Got really, really intense right there. And it only took one night to start. So I wouldn't mind if Kennedy Ryan pursued a full length book about them, maybe following their transitions of, starting a relationship, maybe picking up where this novella started, having her be introduced to the family, his kid, maybe even seeing what they do with their relationship and having their friends, be accepting of it. I feel like Grip and Bristol would be on board with it 100% because they were always so supportive and they recognized their attraction from the beginning. So, yeah, all in all, 4 out of 5 stars because I feel like this is a missed opportunity to expand within the world. But each of her books so far that I've read are taking place within the same dimension, if you will. So, who knows? Maybe my prayers will be answered. The next book that I completed did disappoint me, and that is Butterfly Swords by Jeanine Lin. This is written in third person. It features a historical romance, interracial romance. It is forbidden due to class differences. There are some elements of secret identity, which is due to said class differences. And this follows a princess and a bodyguard. Now, you would think that would work for me, and it had the potential to do so. But then I realized it wasn't enough for me. And that is because I guess there wasn't enough, relationship building. There was definitely more, I guess, informative things that contributed to the written work of the story. This follows Ailey and Ryam. So Ailey fled her betrothal to an enemy of her family, and in doing so, she ran into Ryam on her way home in order to share the news of, the plotting individual against her family. And she enlists his help to, have her safely returned home and reveal her true identity. Some of my favorite moments include their first meeting, the practice fighting with swords and such. Their first time in the grass was lovely. And, father giving his approval and the final homecoming. Those were all just, just a handful of the parts that I enjoyed from this. But some of those were really dragging and it created a reading slump for me. Essentially, in May, I wasn't consuming as much as I would have liked, but I couldn't bring myself to appreciate everything. I will say I did appreciate the cultural information about Chinese culture and the values of honor, and acknowledging that her drive to for a family didn't always align with what Ram saw as always looking out for himself because all he ever was alone, and whereas Ali always had a duty to her family. And there are pros and cons to both things. You have loyalty, and then you have blind loyalty when you're just following because it's always been done. But that doesn't always mean it's right. Sometimes you have to break away from that in order to do what's right, which is something I appreciated in this story. the development of the relationship and the love confessions lacked some of the stomach butterflies I would like to have. So, with that being said, I did give this 2 out of 5 stars. I'm going to briefly go over a trilogy that I did complete this month as well. That would be by Sherry Thomas. The first one's Beguiling a Beauty, second one Ravishing the Heiress, and the last one Tempting the Bride. I will say that I do plan on discussing these books in a separate video by themselves, but I did enjoy it. They are historical romances. Average would be 4 stars for all 3. And yeah, so be on the lookout for that video talking about my first taste of Sherry Thomas's writing. The next book I had to dive into one of my favorite historical romance authors, and that is Kerrigan Byrne with Courting Trouble. This is the second book in the Good Girls series. I will also say that series is linked to the Victorian Rebel series. Both of them are really good. I don't think there's any issue with reading them together, but if you do want to go in chronological order, do start with the Victorian Rebel series and then go into Good Girls. Technically, the first book of the Good Girls series is the 7th book of the Victorian Rebel series. So, with that being said, do with that information as you will. But this book, Courting Trouble, follows Honoria and Titus. This is written in third person, of course, historical romance. It's forbidden romance. There's second chance involved. Again, class differences. Some mention of domestic abuse, violence, and murder. So these are more historical suspense, kind of, or at least that's the vibe I get reading her books. And this one's no different. Titus worked in the Good Household, where he met and fell in love with Honoria at a very young age. They were still in their early teenage years. Their young love was thwarted because of a threat due to greed and power, not being right for each other in terms of class. And with that being said, years later, Honoria finally is brought to Titus, who became medically successful, resident doctor and whatnot, has his own practice. And Honoria was brought to him fatally wounded, and this is the second time that he saves her in her lifetime, because when he was young, she got very ill and he was involved in her recovery. So that was very beautiful to read in here. It's not a thick book, so definitely a quick read, but they are very enticing. I mean, I ended up buying the next 2 books after this one because I knew I wanted to keep devouring the information of this world that she created. So, with that being said, some of my favorite moments include Titus aiding her when she was really sick, because again, this is still when they were really young and the good parents weren't so good to Titus. So that was very intriguing to read in here. There's also the rescue involved when Honoria was injured for deeds of her now deceased husband, his crimes from the first book. So I will say, in order to get better context of Honoria's decisions in this one, it would be good to start with the book prior to this, and that is Seducing a Stranger. That follows Honoria's sister and her love interest in that one, and then this obviously follows this couple. Another thing I enjoyed here as well is that they were each other's first and last, which is also enjoyable for me because I don't know, it's just something about, you know, being able to have those first impressions with each other and then to choose to be with each other in the end, despite what life throws at you. And that was very enjoyable. In here, I do enjoy the introduction of other characters as well, such as the twins, Honoria's younger sisters. They are shown to be introduced with their love interest, and I do intend on getting to their books fairly soon. So, all in all, 5 out of 5 stars. No surprise here for Kerrigan Byrne. It's just about always 4 or 5 stars, maybe 3 at lowest because of reasons, but I'm not going to explain them here because this one was definitely 5. You don't need to know what happened with that 3-star. You'll hear about that when I get there. But this one, definitely 5 out of 5 stars. Looking forward to the next book. You already know. And continuing my Kerrigan Byrne binge, I went into The Highlander, and this is the 3rd book in the Victorian Rebels series. It follows Philomena St. Vincent and Liam Mackenzie. This is a historical romance written in 3rd person. There is an age gap of 12 years. I did not know that going into this, and I was pleasantly surprised because it does not feel weird at all. She went through a lot of life things that just made her mature, but also made her somewhat timid. And Liam was just so caring towards her despite how hard life made him. And it was beautiful. Also, Mina is somewhat plus size, voluptuous woman. We love her with her curves. She's also said to be tall, and that's not as appreciated within upper class England. But in the Highlands, they love a tall girl. So that was very fun to see and hear. I will also say this has a single dad. So Liam, he has 2 grown children, and Philomena was in an asylum, but after she's rescued, she was sent away to the Highlands under a false identity to be the governess of Liam's children. Her husband within England only married her for convenience and put her in the asylum. So in order to protect her and avoid getting caught by said husband, she goes into protection with Liam, and he didn't know her identity. But then when he finds out, he of course is hurt at first because he thought they had something true, but she couldn't fully tell him everything that was going on because, again, her safety. But when he realizes it, he finally sees that, he wants to protect her and he wants to be there for her. So it does take him a second to figure that out, but it was so beautiful. I enjoyed everything in here. Plus, when I realized how long it took for them to actually consummate their relationship, I would say that this is somewhat of a slow burn, or at least not as quick paced as some other books that I have read. But it does not feel like it because for me, their relationship was blossoming at the right moments. Her involvement with his children, who again are grown, his daughter's about to come out the following season in society, and his son is perhaps going to go on to Eton or, whatever. So they're pretty grown already, just still learning how to adjust to their father. And Liam, on his end, because of war and a history of an abusive father as well, he was usually away from home. He was obviously previously married. Something happened to his wife, and following that, he just wasn't home frequently until he decides to return and realizes, hey, I don't know my children as well as I want to, and he decides to be there for them. But all in all, this was pleasantly surprising. I did give this 5 out of 5 stars, if you can't tell by my excitement. But yeah, and the next book after this actually follows Liam's brother, or at least one of his brothers, because some of the men in here in the series are related because of a father that enjoyed spreading his seed. So if that doesn't intrigue you to pursue this series, I don't know what else will. But yeah, they're all scoundrels, but they're loving scoundrels. So there you go. After reading The Highlander, I had no choice but to continue with the series, and the next one's The Duke, the 4th book in the Victorian Rebels series. This is written in 3rd person, of course, historical romance. It's a second chance romance, features grumpy sunshine trope, close proximity, and it does include assault, attempted rape, crime, violence, prejudice, and PTSD. So be forewarned. But again, this follows Imogen and Cole. Imogen was working in a tavern, and that was kind of her nightly job because of a debt her father had to the owner. Cole ended up being one of the customers at said tavern along with his men after battle, and the recent announcement of his family that had perished. Because of that, he became the next person in line for the dukedom, and essentially that's why he's the duke. So that night he kind of gets in his feelings, he has a lot of drinks, and decides to pay for Imogen's services. By doing so, she kind of has no choice in the matter because her boss pushes her to, but nonetheless, Cole did treat her nicely that night. She was in disguise, so a year later, after he was missing in action, he was rescued. However, he was fatally sick, and she realizes the reason behind it, but because of that, she ends up going behind the back of her boss, the head doctor of the facility, and this ends up resulting in her being fired, losing her job. Cole, when he wakes up, he doesn't even recognize her, nor does he show his thanks or gratefulness to her kindness. After that, that same night, or I believe shortly thereafter, when she returns to the tavern, she is assaulted and nearly, well, nearly raped and injured by this attacker. But she defends herself. By doing so, she thinks that she'll be charged for it because of her crimes, but even though it was self-defense. So she flees, and by doing so, she ends up running to a man who was a friend to her, someone who's elderly, someone sick, and he decides to say, "Hey, why don't you marry me for convenience, and I'll protect you in name and with money, and you'll have your freedom to do with your time what you will." So he recognized the kindness in her, and she was always kind to him. So, yes, her marriage was brief, but there was genuine friendship there. Following the death of her husband, she ends up being very free spirited next door to Cole, who's not very pleasant with her presence because he assumes that she only married for the money and to gain I guess a step forward into upper class. He thinks she's aiming above her station, and that was something I didn't appreciate in here, because I wish it was more so like he maybe didn't like her but didn't understand why he didn't like her when in fact he really did. It's just it was quite prejudice on his part, considering the fact that he would search for the woman he found in the tavern, and she has to hide her own identity from him because she's worried again that her past will come back to haunt her. And things escalate in here. I will say that I enjoyed the Crimson Room, which is where they first encounter each other. Meeting in the garden was very adorable, and having other characters be presented from previous books, I enjoyed that as well. There's the rush of concern when a crime is committed. There's sparring involved with another hero from the Victorian Rebel series I enjoyed. Got to see some artistic pursuits and appreciation together in the park, which was very beautiful to witness. And the Victorian Rebels' wives were conversing at one point as a group and being supportive, whatnot. The suspenseful end as well, I really enjoyed. It's not so much that it wasn't obvious, because again, it just comes down to putting the scenes in order as the author may. But all in all, this was still 4 out of 5 stars. The only thing that really took a star away from this, though, would have to be the fact that there were some scenes that took away from the story of Imogen and Cole. Specifically, talking about Inspector Morley, because Inspector Morley gets his own story in the Good Girls series. His book is the first one of that, titled Seducing a Stranger. And in this book, it does hint at his night work. And that's all I'll say, because I don't want to spoil from that story. You'll just have to read both series respectively. But yeah, that's the only thing I would say really took away from the stories. Otherwise, I probably would have given it 5 stars anyway, despite their first encounters. So yeah, all in all, still very good. And yeah, I do plan on continuing the series after this. Last but not least, I read This Earl of Mine by Kate Bateman. I did come across this copy at my local thrift store, so I thought, why not pick it up? I've heard great things about this author, and I had yet to try her books. I also had access to the audiobook on Hoopla, so I thought, why not read it physically and listen to it together? So I don't know if because of that, I ended up making this not work in my favor. Physically reading, I end up absorbing more of the story, but I'm at a slower pace. Whereas listening to it, I can immerse myself audio wise and be able to absorb it at a faster speed. But when I was trying to do it together, that probably didn't work in my favor. This is written in third person, it's historical romance, marriage of convenience. There's some fake dating component in here as well, assault involved, and kidnapping. So essentially, this is between Benedict and Georgiana. So Benedict, as the second son of a broke earl, was working for Bow Street undercover when Georgiana practically forced him to marry, thinking he could be the absentee husband she desired to escape the desperation of her fortune-hunting cousin. So basically, he was in disguise, in jail, and Georgiana, thinking she could avoid the controlling nature of her cousin who wanted her fortune, she marries an inmate thinking that he's going to die and she could be that independent widow. But alas, her selected husband lives and they end up running into each other at a ball. All great things for a premise, right? That's what drew me to the story. But there were very few times where I actually was invested in the story. And again, this could be my problem because of the format that I chose, or formats, plural. I ended up doing it physically and audiobook together. Probably not my wisest decision, but I'm still going to pursue the rest of the series because, again, I feel like the fault was mine here. And some of my favorite moments included the shock of their first meeting outside of his disguise. There's also defense from assault. He defended her, essentially. And there's the masquerade library search, which, again, I don't remember now because, again, the plot, I just wasn't absorbing it as well as I could have. In short, rich girl got a husband with a contract to avoid fortune hunters, but they maintained the farce in order to, keep things up within society. What can I say? That about sums up my interest in the book. I did give this 2 out of 5 stars, but again, I will be reading the book that follows this shortly. I already got the audiobook for it, so yeah. The fault I feel like was mine here. Maybe I'll try to reread it someday, but that's not right now. And only choose one format this time because reading along just did not work for me. And that concludes all of the books that I read for the month of May. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any thoughts about these books as well, feel free to comment them down below, but always be respectful. And I will say that if you have any recommendations, I'm always willing to try things at least once. However, how soon, yet to be determined. Already got a really long backlist of books I want to go through. So with that being said, I'm Alexis, and thanks for watching. Until next time, happy reading.